Viking 1 and 2, a trailblazer in space exploration. Viking 1 and 2 were the most important unmanned space missions of all time. They were the first spacecrafts to successfully maintain connection on Mars, take pictures, and send them back to Earth to be exchanged with the world. They obtained samples of the Martian soil, which was tested for life. Due to the exchanging of ideas and information, these visionaries, scientists, and manufacturers solved the many problems encountered throughout the projects, which ultimately contributed to the mission's success and advancements in space exploration and technology. After the success of Apollo 14 and Mariner 9 in 1971, and then Skylab in 1973, NASA wanted to contribute something else to win the space race. So they turned away from the moon and its iconic landing in 1969 and looked towards Mars. They also wanted to look to the future and find a place besides Earth that could support life. If possible, Mars could be a backup to Earth. The U.S. was not alone in the exploration of Mars.
Russia had tried before the U.S. to land on Mars but failed.
Finally, at the end of 1971, Russia sent another Mars mission, Mars 3. It was successful in landing. However, it retained connection for only 14.5 seconds. This was a chance for the US to one-up the Soviets and win the Cold War. The Viking crew worked tirelessly on the landers and orbiters, which allowed Viking 1 to launch on August 20th, 1975, and Viking 2 on September 9th, 1976. The Vikings completed the 24-month, 34-million-mile journey to Mars. Viking 1 landed on July 20th, 1976. This was just 2 weeks after America's bicentennial. Viking 2 followed up by landing on September 3rd, 1976. From then on, the USSR Mars 3 mission was history, and the Vikings were the future.
I and every member of that analysis team was bound and determined to be there in the room next to the mission control room and hear everything happen in real time. This was historic.
The American people couldn't be happier. The Vikings became a patriotic symbol. NASA had beat the USSR
To successfully land on Mars.
The Viking expeditions are considered to be the finishing blow in the space race. Many of the engineers, scientists, and visionaries that worked on the Viking missions also worked on later missions. Their exchange of ideas and spacecraft designs led to the successful creation of Martian rovers such as Pathfinder, Spirit, and Opportunity. The legacy of the Viking missions inspired the next generation of space exploration.
Simply put, the Viking laid the foundation for our planetary programs, not just where we have the ability to go, and not just where we should land, but what kind of things we should be looking for once we do.
The Viking orbiters mapped all of Mars, giving future landers and rovers possible landing zones. These missions took much higher resolution and better quality images than the previous Mariner 9's aerial images.
Because the images from the Mariner mission were so low resolution, you could see a football field, and that's the analogy they used. But you couldn't tell what you were going to land on.
The landers were essential in our understanding of Mars.
This is true because before the Vikings,
We had only gotten about 1.4 years worth of Mars data. By our arguing in support of all of the other people, we ended up with 3.3 Mars years of data.
this made them milestones in space exploration. They were the first landers to maintain connection on Mars and complete their mission. They took pictures on and above the planet's surface and analyzed Martian soil that was tested for evidence of life and water. Victor Baker and the Viking team exchanged the data from the pictures and soil analysis with the rest of the world and were able to demonstrate that Mars did have a history of water.
Trying to convince the physicists and chemists that Mars had this early history of water was difficult because Mars today is very cold, very dry. Water is very little activity. When it is present, it's frozen. If it was present on the surface for any long period of time, it would sublimate into the atmosphere.
One of the ways the Vikings impacted space exploration was by creating new technology and terminology. A problem they encountered was how they were going to power the expeditions. Because there was not enough sunlight to use solar panels, the Vikings had to exchange possible solutions. They ended up creating devices called radioisotope thermoelectric generators. These work by creating electricity from the heat given off by the natural decay of plutonium. The generators have been used on 27 missions, including the Vikings, and have become a major step for all space exploration. These technologies allowed for the expeditions to surpass their mission time of 90 sols. A sol is a term used for a Martian day. The word sol was created by the Viking project members to prevent confusion of an Earth day and a Mars day. The success of the Viking missions were possible because of all the problems the team encountered. These problems were solved by the exchange and the exploration of new ideas.
In my opinion, Viking moved our knowledge of Mars from 0 to 90% of what we know today.
The Viking crew encountered many challenges, including the missions being delayed due to lack of funding. The dedicated efforts of the mission crew, including Jim Tillman, convinced the government to continue financing the Viking projects.
The success of Viking led to funding of important projects.
The need to develop small and lightweight scientific instruments and the intricate requirements for a successful touchdown were additional challenges. Learning from the failures of the Soviet missions and by exchanging ideas, they gained insight into Martian landing. The thin Martian atmosphere does not provide a strong enough natural resistance to slow the spacecrafts to landing speed. Viking 1 was the first spacecraft to successfully pass through an atmosphere other than Earth and deploy a parachute at supersonic speed.
I myself was involved in some other Mars missions, and I had to use the data from Viking in order to figure out how fast a spacecraft coming into Mars would settle through the atmosphere and how fast it would be going when it came close to the surface, and how you could determine when you should fire the retro rockets, and if you didn't fire them within the right second of time, you would crash. Either you went too early or too late.
The Vikings were the first to explore the Martian landscape and take photos of the surface. The photos were exchanged with the whole world. These historic and revolutionary pictures astounded everyone. Scientists knew little about Mars beforehand, so these pictures were a huge contribution to the new knowledge about Mars and what other planets could possibly be like.
I still remember the thrill when it landed, and watching that first picture come in was really awe-inspiring.
The Vikings continued to impact today's generation through the Viking Mars Missions Education and Preservation Project. This online museum is available for people to learn about the Vikings, their story, and its everlasting impact. The knowledge gained by the Vikings will be used in future Mars missions, ultimately taking humans. Did the Vikings impact space exploration?
Yes, indeed. They completely changed our understanding.
And because of this understanding, we know that space was not always the same. So newer missions are not only designed to explore the present and future, but also the past. In conclusion, the Vikings' exploration of Mars was the most successful space missions of the 20th century, as stated by John Newcomb in his book, A Bunch of Plumbers.
Viking was the first successful landing on Mars, and that's very historic.
The project encountered difficult tasks. The Viking members relentlessly exchanged solutions until they found an answer. They would let no obstacle hold them back. The expeditions resulted in landing on Mars, sharing pictures of the surface, gathering samples of the soil, and opening a new chapter in the history of space. This is just a small part of why Vikings 1 and 2 were trailblazers in the fields of exploration, encounter, and exchange.